Story 1. It was around 9:45 at the time, on April the 18th. I know it was because that was the special date I'd set aside to go down to visit my girl. We have something of a long distance relationship, and I'd been waiting months for that day. I calculated how long it would take for me to save up enough money to, first of all, go down there to visit her, and then to be able to take her out on the date, and finally, to be able to have enough money to drive back the whole 8 hours back home. And the date I reached was the 18th of April. But the reason why I was driving back by 9:45 is because of a minor miscalculation. I hadn't accounted for how much fun I'd have, and so she ended up keeping me in her house longer than I'd expected. So I ended up only leaving her place at around 6. So now the skies were completely black and the wind was very cold outside, and also my gas was running pretty low, so I had no choice but to stop at the nearest 7-Eleven I could find. When I got there, I put gas in my car and I went inside the shop to buy myself something to eat. It was fairly late, but not so late as to expect nobody to be around, and yet there was nobody around, not even the receptionist. It was literally just me and this incessant tapping sound. This weirded me out. I walked around the store and picked up all that I wanted. Then I walked to the counter. But when I got to the counter, I heard a soft tapping sound more clearly. And I turned around to see where it was coming from. It was coming from a man. There was a man sitting at the corner with his knees pulled to his chest. He was banging the side of his head against the rack, and his eyes were looking at me unblinkingly. He was wearing the receptionist's clothes. I immediately got out of there, having seen enough, and made it to my car. I drove off, and when I was a distance away, I looked to my mirror, and I saw it. The man was standing there, and he was just staring at me. That was when I realized I had escaped something that could have potentially been quite disastrous. Story 2. This story happened when I was a child. We'd gone to a number of field trips when I was younger, and this was one of them. We'd gone to a dairy farm. We learned about animals and how yogurt and milk was made. But the downside of this is that we drank a lot of liquids, and by the time we were out on the road, I could barely hold anything inside. Luckily for me, we stopped at a station to get some diesel for the bus, and so I could jump out and run to the bathroom. I ran out and I looked for the sign leading to the bathroom, and I finally found it. It was right above us. I walked into that direction, but as I did, a man wearing a dirty jacket jumped out in front of me. He smiled down at me and asked where I was going. I pointed to the bathroom, and he told me that those aren't working anymore, and this crushed my soul. I told him I really had to go, and he said, "All right, then I should follow him," and in my desperation, I ran after him. He led me out the bathroom and around the station. It was when I saw that we were walking into the woods that I finally stopped. I asked him where we were going, and he said I wanted to use the bathroom, so he is taking me there. I told him that I couldn't go without my teacher's permission. The guy said, "Just come on," yelling at me, and that made whatever pee I felt disappear. Now, I just wanted to get out of there. The guy must have seen it on my face, because he said, no, sorry, I didn't mean that." But it was too late. I turned and was walking away, but he reached out and grabbed my wrist. I squeaked, and that's when he suddenly let me go. I ran away and ended up accidentally running into somebody. It was my teacher. She asked the man what he was doing. He said he was catching me from falling. I told her he was lying, and he only laughed. My teacher told him to get out of there or she was going to call the cops. And the guy said okay, and then he walked off. But he let his eyes linger on me, with that smile of his that didn't meet them. Story 3. I went out to pee one time when I was driving on the national road. It was a long trip ahead of me, and I was on the schedule. so I drove off before I got the chance to properly empty my bladder or anything like that. But luckily enough, I knew I could just stop at any location I saw fit in the road and take a piss, then be back on my merry way, and I felt like taking a piss right then. As I drove off, looking for a perfect place to stop, I finally found the right spot. There was an opening by the road where I could park my car, and I could then go pee. I noticed that on the other side of the road, there was a car parked there. It was going the opposite direction to where I was going. I got out of the car and ran to the grass, and I took a piss, and as I was flapping myself dry, I heard a squelching sound like an orange being pounded. It came from the bush in front of me. I shrugged and went back to my car and closed the door behind me. Then I started the car, and that's when I saw it. A head of a man sprang out from the side of the bush. The man looked around a bit, and then his eyes settled on me, and pure shock and panic spread on his face. I decided, let me pretend I didn't know he was doing number 2 in there, and so I drove off. As I was driving off, I looked in the mirror, and I saw him run to the streets and stare at me, and in his hand, he was holding a bat that was dripping with red liquid. That made me cold, and I looked ahead. I was so lucky to have driven off and not looked back. Moments later, as I was driving, I was just looking in the rear view mirror to test and see if the guy was there or not. And the guy was right behind me, driving up as fast as he could. I drove faster, and when I saw a station up ahead, I drove inside and parked by the pump. I got out and tried to look calm, but my legs were shaking. I walked to the shop and looked around a bit. Just moments later, the doors opened and I ducked down. I could see the man on the mirror, looking around with a crazy look in his eye. The receptionist tried to greet him, and he was ignored. I walked around while crouching, and I made it to the door. I ran to my car and got in. His car was parked right in front of mine. I reversed and drove off, having to drive over the lawn. But then I was gone, and I drove off, driving as fast as I could. I have never seen that man since, and boy am I glad. Story 4. We have a gas station close to our apartment complex, but I've never really visited it much. But a few days ago, I was really craving soda drinks, so I decided I'd go out there to buy myself something. It was really late at night, and I wondered if they'd closed, but no, they were surprisingly open when I arrived. But again, it was still fairly late, and therefore there weren't any outside. And inside the store, I was the only person walking up and down. I saw the soda that I wanted. It was a Coca-Cola, and maybe a 7-Up for good measure. And then I bought a few snacks and a hot dog. I was going to get myself chocolate when I noticed something. There was a guy there, dressed in a black hoodie. He was standing literally at the corner to the counter, and he had covered his head and was facing the wall. His hands ran up and down the sides of his arms, as if he were cold, and he wouldn't look up. I didn't know what the hell was that all about. But I knew one thing, and that was that I wanted nothing to do with it. And so I decided to not get the chocolate, and instead I walked straight to the counter. I kept my eyes to the floor, to the walls, heck, even to the face of the receptionist there. As long as I didn't look at the guy in the corner, I was fine with it. The receptionist greeted me and asked how I was doing. I told him I was alright, and then I noticed that, although it was cold, the receptionist was sweating. I told him this, and he snorted, laughing harder than I expected. I smiled back and waited for him to finish with my things, but then I realized that his smile was actually getting wider, and then I turned to see the guy at the corner. He had spun around now, and he was looking at me. His face was fairly young, and he looked panicked, but determined, and he pulled out a blade that gleamed from his pocket. I'm telling you now, Time just went slow for a moment, and I can remember in great detail what happened next. The receptionist grabbed my wrist and yelled, "Now!" Then the guy in black, who looked to be in his teens, screamed and charged me. Now I was in full fight or flight mode. I screamed and ran away, pulling the man holding my wrist with me. He flung over the edge and let me go, and the guy in black tried to catch his friend. I took that moment to run out of there, and I didn't stop running even when I was outside. I looked behind me and saw that the guy had run outside too, but they could only watch. I was long gone.